Black artist paints the judge's daughter, but her father's name could ruin his life forever. He had spent his entire life mastering the language of colors, shapes, and emotions, painting what words could never say. His small studio sat in the quiet part of the city, surrounded by cracked walls and old bricks, yet inside it breathed life. Every corner was filled with unfinished portraits, broken brushes, and the scent of oil paint that never seemed to fade. Each stroke he painted carried a story, his struggles, his memories, his pain. One misty morning, as the sunlight slipped gently through the blinds, a sleek black car stopped outside his studio. The sound of polished shoes echoed as a man in a dark suit approached the door, holding a sealed envelope embossed with a golden emblem. It looked official, expensive, and out of place in this worn-down street. The artist hesitated before opening it, his heart already uneasy. When he finally tore it open, the words inside stunned him. It was a request from the city's most powerful man, a judge whose name commanded fear and respect. The letter offered him a commission to paint a portrait of the judge's daughter as a gift for her upcoming birthday. The pay was more than anything he'd earned in years, enough to rebuild his studio, to start fresh, to finally live without worry. But as his eyes fell upon the name signed at the bottom, his breath caught in his chest. The name was one he would never forget. It was the same judge who had sentenced his father years ago for a crime he never committed, the man who had destroyed his family's name and left them in ruin. His father had died behind cold prison bars, whispering the same name in bitterness till his last breath. The artist sat frozen, the letter trembling in his hands. His heart was a storm, anger, grief, temptation, and fear colliding at once. Part of him wanted to tear the letter apart, to reject anything connected to that man. But another voice deep inside whispered something else. Maybe this was fate. Maybe life had finally brought him face to face with the man who had caused all his pain. He looked around his studio at the empty canvases leaning against the walls, and he knew this moment could change everything. If he accepted, he would be walking into the lion's den, into the house of the man who had taken everything from him. But if he refused, he would forever live with what-ifs. Slowly, he folded the letter, placed it on his table, and stared at it for a long time. His hands were shaking, but his mind was clear now. He would take the commission, not for the money, not for revenge, but to confront the past that haunted him for years. It was time to face the truth through the one thing he trusted most, his art. The following week, the artist found himself standing before the mansion that looked more like a fortress than a home. Its marble pillars stretched high into the sky, and every step he took toward those massive wooden doors echoed with uncertainty. When the door finally opened, it wasn't the judge who stood there, but his daughter. She was nothing like he expected. Gentle eyes, a soft voice, and a presence that felt warm rather than proud. She welcomed him inside with quiet politeness, leading him through long hallways decorated with portraits of ancestors who seemed to stare down in judgment. The house was filled with silence, a kind that felt both grand and lonely. She led him to a bright room where light poured through tall windows, and that was where she would sit for her portrait. As he unpacked his brushes and paints, he could feel her watching him, curious about the stranger her father had chosen to immortalize her beauty. Each day he returned, and each day she sat gracefully while he painted her. At first they spoke little, just brief exchanges about the weather or the time. But soon, conversations began to flow naturally between the strokes of his brush. She told him about her love for books, her secret wish to travel, and how she felt trapped by her father's expectations. He listened silently, torn between admiration and guilt, for the secret he carried was too heavy for words. Her laughter filled the room, chasing away the mansion's stillness, and he found himself painting not just her face, but the light that danced in her eyes. Yet, beneath every stroke lay a shadow of truth. She was the daughter of the man who had ruined his father's life. As he watched her smile, he felt torn apart by two worlds, one filled with rage and memory, the other with beauty and understanding. Every time she thanked him for his kindness, it pierced deeper, because she didn't know the reason his hands sometimes trembled as he painted. She would speak of how her father worked tirelessly for justice, unaware that the justice she spoke of had once been her father's weapon against his own blood. The artist wanted to tell her everything, to confess that her father's decisions had destroyed his family, but something in her innocence stopped him. She was pure, untouched by her father's cruelty, and he didn't want to stain that purity with pain. As the portrait neared completion, he found himself painting slower, unwilling to let the days end. He had entered that mansion with anger, but now he feared what would happen when the truth surfaced. Each brushstroke became a silent battle, between forgiveness and vengeance, between love and memory. And as the final color dried on the canvas, he knew that what bound them together wasn't just art anymore, but a fate that neither of them could escape. One late evening, the artist stood before the canvas, adding the final touches to the portrait that had consumed his days and haunted his nights. The room was bathed in soft golden light, the sound of his brush gliding gently against the canvas the only thing breaking the silence. He had just captured the last hint of her smile when the door suddenly opened behind him. The air grew colder. Standing in the doorway was the judge himself, tall, stern, and intimidating in his dark suit. His presence carried the same weight it once did in courtrooms, the kind that could silence anyone with a glance. The artist froze, his heart thundering in his chest as the judge stepped closer, his polished shoes echoing across the marble floor. His sharp eyes swept over the painting, then narrowed as they landed on the artist. "I've seen your work before," the judge said, his tone controlled but edged with suspicion. "You have real talent. But your name, it sounds familiar." The artist felt the blood drain from his face. The room seemed to shrink around him, every sound fading into silence except for the steady pounding of his heart. He knew this moment would come, though he hadn't expected it so soon. Slowly, he set his brush down, meeting the judge's gaze without flinching. "It should sound familiar," he said, his voice trembling slightly but laced with years of buried pain. "You once stood in court and sentenced my father for a crime he didn't commit." The words fell heavy, slicing through the room like a blade. The judge's daughter, who had been quietly watching nearby, gasped, her face draining of color as she looked from her father to the artist. The judge's expression hardened, a flash of confusion crossing his stern face before it settled into recognition. His lips parted, but no words came out. The artist's voice rose, not in anger but in grief that had long been caged. "My father was an honest man, and your verdict destroyed his life. He died in prison, still believing justice would find him." The silence that followed was suffocating. The daughter's eyes welled with tears as the truth unfolded before her. The man she admired now cast in a shadow she had never seen. The judge looked shaken, his confidence cracking under the weight of the past he had long buried. The artist turned away, unable to meet their eyes any longer, his breath trembling as he tried to steady himself. He had not planned to confront the judge like this, but the truth had escaped on its own, unstoppable after years of silence. The painting behind him now seemed to glow with painful irony, a portrait born from a broken history. For the first time, the judge had nothing to say. The power he once held meant nothing in that room, and in that moment both men stood surrounded by the ghosts of the past, one haunted by guilt, the other finally free from silence. The morning sun crept slowly across the mansion, its golden light spilling through the tall windows and illuminating the quiet halls. The artist stood in the doorway of the grand room one last time, his eyes fixed on the finished portrait that stood proudly on the easel. It was the most beautiful piece he had ever painted, not just because of the subject, but because of what it represented. Every brushstroke carried truth, pain, and forgiveness. The judge's daughter sat gracefully on the canvas, her face serene yet strong, her eyes holding both innocence and understanding. It was no longer just a painting, it was a mirror of their shared revelation. As he gathered his brushes and prepared to leave, he noticed a folded note resting on the table beside the portrait. The handwriting was delicate and familiar. He opened it slowly and read her words in silence. She thanked him for the art, but more importantly, for opening her eyes to a truth she had never seen. She confessed that her world had always been built on her father's reputation, but now she could no longer ignore the cracks beneath it. She wrote that she would speak to him, not as a daughter defending her family, but as a woman demanding honesty. Her words were filled with grace, but also strength. The artist felt a deep ache in his chest as he read the final line. You showed me that real art doesn't just capture faces, it reveals souls." He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his coat pocket, leaving the mansion with a heavy yet peaceful heart. The air outside felt different, lighter, as if years of pain had finally begun to fade. Weeks passed, and the memory of that house slowly turned into a distant echo. Then, one afternoon, as he sat painting quietly in his studio, a knock sounded on the door. A delivery boy handed him a small envelope sealed with the same golden emblem that once brought him pain. Inside was the payment for his work, and a letter written in a firm, elegant hand. It was from the judge. The words were brief but carried the weight of a lifetime. "I cannot undo what I have done," the note read, "but I will never forget the son who chose to face me with art instead of hate." The artist sat in silence, reading it over and over, unsure if it was an apology or a confession. But it didn't matter anymore. He walked over to the finished portrait and hung it in his studio. Every time he looked at it, he saw not the judge's daughter, but the story of redemption, the moment when pain met truth and transformed into beauty. It was no longer a symbol of his past suffering. It was a reminder that forgiveness, like art, was something only the brave could create.